love being with teachers. I love being with teachers. I love what we do. And what I love about the fact that we're all engaged in something that has national significance. National significance. Matter of fact, just recently we've had the budget. There's always a lot of talk about the dollars. So does anybody actually know in Australia, across all levels of government, federal, state, etc., how much money is spent on education annually? How much? $87,857 million, or in my view, the other way of saying is $88 billion. Couldn't get the figures for this year, so that was for 15-16. $88 billion. Levels of government spend on education. Now with that, it's not surprising that when you're spending that much money on something that is so important, that the government likes having a few reviews. And it's interesting that when you look here, the Weekend Australian, look here, the federal government has spent $4.5 million on 26 reviews, option papers, inquiries and discussion papers in the higher education and research sector since they came into power. That's the Liberals. 26 reviews. Now that's the sector that I'm in the early childhood, primary, secondary sector, You guys aren't immune from reviews, are you? How many have we had? I mean, we all go, I suppose, Gonski's the flavour of the month yet again. And we've had reviews into spending and how we're going to pay for everything. But there's been reviews into the curriculum. And before you know it, there's just review after review after review. Why do we do it? Why have reviews? I mean, it would seem that the government, I like the fact the Liberals are actually having a number of reviews because they're trying to get information from the experts to say, right, are we doing a good job of this? Are we spending money in the right ways? Is this the way forward? So reviews in many ways aren't bad things. When you get so many of them, they can become a bit of a pain in the neck. I would like to, though, move to Adventist education. And tonight, what I'd like to do is just embark on a little bit of a review process with you. Now, Adventist education's been around a long time. Matter of fact, the first school in Wisconsin, 1872, 33 students. Only person in this room alive at that time was probably Lyndon and Darryl. The rest of us weren't even thought of. And we know that this school was set up on the principles that Ellen White had written in the book Proper Education. Now, this is not the book Education. This is her writings on education, where she talked about the distinction between education and training and the idea of having discipline as a sense of self-control and the need for a practical and useful education and a balance there of the mental and spiritual aspects along with the physical. And these were those big sort of foundational things that were put into place in that school. And so we had the birth of Adventist education. All of you in your book, I'm assuming it's all of you, or am I just special? When I looked in my satchel, I got a copy of this book. You all seen it? You know what? This book must be special because in the last week, I've had 3 people now give me copies of this book. Kevin Petrie led the charge over there, and his was beautifully written in, actually, and so that was nice. But now I've got 3 copies, one for each eye, and I don't want to go with the third. George Knight, though, what a pillar for Adventist education. That guy, I thought he retired years ago. But here he is in 2016 writing this book. And it's interesting that when you go in there, the first part really is a précis of his original work on philosophy of Christian ed, but the second part is a really interesting read, part 2. And he outlines for us what was the purpose of Adventist education. And those of you who've done philosophy classes at Avondale, I even recognise some of you have sat in the room with me talking about this. This is Knight's diagram, which I think we'll all agree with. He sees the primary aim of Adventist education was leading young people into a saving relationship with Jesus Christ. He has the secondary aims there of character development and the development of the Christian mind and social responsibility and physical, emotional and social health and the world of work, with the ultimate aim of service to God and other people for both here and the hereafter. I love the way that diagram just summarises what we're all about. And I look at that and I say, that's it. That's what we do. That's what we do. And particularly, I like his section towards the end of the book where he looks at the strategic role of education. And I love the fact that he points out that Adventist education has both conservative and revolutionary roles. It is conservative in the sense that it seeks to transmit the unchanging truths of the Bible across time, but it's revolutionary as a change agent of a righteous God in a sinful world. And he challenges us that if we're doing a good job as Christian educators, what we'll be doing is introducing young people to Jesus Christ as their personal saviour and then challenging them to go out and be change agents in the world. Mate, it gets me excited just talking about it. And that's why, I read a lot about teacher burnout and everything else, but I tell you what, teaching is a demanding profession. But the schools I visit, you can just see it in the teachers' eyes that they believe in what they do. And I genuinely do believe that working in the Adventist system is a calling. So suddenly, here we are. Can you believe it? 16 has rolled over to 2017, and not only that, we are nearly halfway through 2017. I look around and I'm going to be old before I know it. The only good news is some of you are going to be before me. And the challenge for us in 2017 is simply we should ask ourselves the question, are we still doing the job that needs to be done? Are we still doing the job? See, this morning I went and just Googled Adventist education and I hit image search. Then I went tools, large. And this is what came out. And I tell you, some of these, it takes me back. There's Carlisle Christian College. You see this upstanding group of young kids from Avondale schools, it looks like. But I tell you what, some of the pictures are just downright scary. But what I want to know, folks, you look at these and we feel so good about the schools that we have. I go to campus after campus that you can just be so genuinely proud of. But guys, how successful are we at navigating our way in a complex world? Are we still on track? That's the question. When I do a lot of bushwalking, I took a bunch of kids to Tasmania on a camp, and as Tasmania would have, it was a bit cold and gnarly and a bit rainy, and I watched the group set off, and they walked off into the distance, and before you know it, they were disappearing. And as I watched that group progress, that photo is actually the last I saw of that group for about 18 hours. They didn't get to their campsite at night time where they were meant to be. I mean, I was there. They weren't. And when we eventually found them, they were only about 8 kilometres off course. I actually said to them, what are you doing? And they said, the kids were navigating, and every time they came to an obstacle, they sort of just turned right, and we just kept on turning right. And before you know it, instead of walking that way, we're walking this way. And we were up the back having a chat, and no one sort of picked it up, and suddenly we didn't know where we were. And I said, hang on a minute, let's get this straight. It was a beautiful day. Mount Jerusalem was there on your left. You're walking along. At some stage, as you did your U-turn, that massive mountain would have been on your right. You know how, like, when you're walking along, you're walking into the sun, and then after an hour, you're walking away from the sun? Didn't any of these things start ringing an alarm bell that mountain shouldn't be over there? And they basically said, no, we just didn't attend to it. We didn't even think about it. So what I'd like to know is, in an Adventist education, are all the indicators at the moment showing that we're going the right way? Is the mountain on the left where it should be? Is the sun in front of us? Do we attend to these signs? See, for me, I think the Adventist Church set up Adventist education for a reason. I mean, you go all the way back to 1844. You just imagine that time of the Millerite movement there, where you can just feel the energy in the room as they preach Christ's imminent return, and people flocked in their thousands to those tents. And they gathered on that morning of October 22, 1844 on Ascension Rock, really expecting Jesus was coming back. And it's been called, as we know, the Great Disappointment. And out of that time of searching the Bible and just saying what actually happened, there was a bunch of people that got together. And they formed a movement. And that movement became the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And finally, in 1863, from very humble beginnings, this is the building where they decided that the Seventh-day Adventist Church was going to become an organisation. And here are the people that were running the show. The original conference presidents. And then down the track, we found that these people, as the Seventh-day Adventist Church started gaining momentum, they thought, let's start paying attention to preparing more people to work as missionaries. So they set up Battle Creek College in 1868. And you know what? It was a huge disappointment. Ran for a bit, then shut, because nobody knew what they were doing. But they learned from their mistakes and they pushed on. And so in 1872, they set up a school. And then in 1892, now I'm a math science person, I'm not much of a historian, but I am so impressed that in 1892, in Australia, we got the Australasian Bible School. And you know where? Here, in Melbourne, George Street. And it ran for a while, but they had a vision. That Ellen White had a vision that as this place was set up to train people to be workers for Christ, that it was going to be in a rural setting, not in an urban setting. And so they scoured the place. They had no money, but of course they found the promised land in Cooranbong. And we ended up with Avondale College. No need for any speed humps down that driveway. They're built in. And Avondale came into existence. And Ellen White in these times was very influential. As you can just sort of feel it gaining momentum. And in Australia, we ended up with setting up primary and secondary schools. And in the book that she wrote in 1903, that book Education, she set forward, she didn't wait, did she? In the very first sentence, on the very first page, she gave us our mission. Our ideas of education take too narrow and too low a range. There's need for a broader scope, a higher aim. And from that, I get the idea that we've got to have an expansive vision for what we're doing. It's expansive. It's not reductionist. True education means more than the perusal of a certain course of study. It means more than a preparation for the life that now is. It has to do with the whole being and the whole period of existence possible to man. Recognise the importance of perspective in the bigger picture. Now, my college students rip me off all the time about paragliding stories. Darryl, even over dinner, pointed out that I told the odd paragliding story. And so, no presentation from me would be complete without a picture of me and a paraglider. Now, I'll put that in because Darren Morton is in the audience and we just want to see tomorrow what sort of lame picture he comes up with himself and a hang glider. Paragliding is genuinely good fun, and let me assure you that when you're whizzing around the place, you actually do get a very good perspective. We were in Hickson Street one day, and a guy was flying with his remote-controlled plane, radio-controlled plane, and then it all went haywire on him. He was just a beginner, and he lost it. And he went down the front of Hickson Street in Merriweather, and it's the bush, when you're in the sky, doesn't look that bad, but when you're down there, it's way over your head. And I could see him down there fumbling his way through the bush looking for his plane. And as I was flying around, I noticed after about an hour he was still down there searching. And yet, as I flew over, I could see his plane sitting in the top of a tree, clear as crystal. And so I sort of zoomed over there, yelling at him, "It's over this way." He recovered it. The difference just having that clear perspective makes. And for us, when Ellen White talks about the fact that what we've got to do is consider the whole perspective. Darryl talked about the book Unchristian. Gabe Lyons, who was one of the authors of that book, wrote a follow-up book, which I've just finished reading, called The Next Christians. And he challenges us to consider the whole perspective that is open to us as Christians. I mean, the Christian story is a story of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. And in this book, at times when he points out how Christians get a bit of a bad rap, he points out the fact that we're really good at pushing the middle to the fall and redemption story. But in actual fact, right now, we are living squarely in the restoration phase. And what we should be doing is engaging ourselves in acts of restoration in our world. To restore in man the image of his maker. To bring him back to the perfection in which he was created, to promote the development of body, mind and soul, that the divine purpose in his creation might be realised. This is the object of education, the great object of life. Guys, we're in the restoration business. That's what we do. That's what we do. I mean, restoration, it's such an amazing thing. You know, it's the harmonious development of the physical, the mental and the spiritual powers. We know that Ellen White wrote three major themes. She wrote on the great controversy, on health, on education. But what I can tell you is that in the book Education, all of these came together into the one volume. Matter of fact, Willie White sent off the book to be proofread, and actually wrote, and he said, more of the plan of redemption has been worked in by the drawing from Mother's published works, such as Patriarchs and Prophets, Great Controversy, Desire of Ages, Mount of Blessings and Christ's Object Lessons. He declared, he said, we have tried to bring the whole thing together here, because education is not just about one dimension. It's got to do with salvation, with health, with learning. It's the total package. And we all know to educate the whole person. And it prepares the student for the joy of service in this world and the higher joy of wider service in the world to come. So far, everything I've said, no doubt you guys all know. You all know it. I mean, I sat in Trevor Lloyd's philosophy classes back in the 70s. Who else? Anybody else in there with Trevor? You know, well, this is just the fundamentals that we're exposed to as we prepare ourselves to be Adventist teachers. We should live and breathe it. We have got these great educational principles that we find that our schools are based on. Can you just hit forward on that for me? Thanks, Glendon. Looks like we're stuck. So we have an expansive vision for education. You know, we have this big picture and eternal context. And students are seen as having unlimited potential. It's restorative and redemptive in focus. And this education is relevant and useful and holistic in focus. So tell me, people, are we still on track? Is the landscape telling us that we're heading in the right direction? You know, what does it mean in 2017 to prepare students for the joy of service in this world? See, I think that we have a problem. I think we do. Because some of the indicators are telling me that things aren't as they should be. Mission Australia every year has a survey, and you know, the youth survey, and so the latest one that we've got the data for was done in 2016, where they had nearly 22,000 young people aged between 15 and 19 fill out their survey. Now, if you're into research like me, let me tell you, anytime you get a sample like that, this is impressive. They asked these people what they thought the top 3 national issues were in Australia. The top 3 national issues, and here they are. Alcohol and drugs, discrimination and equity, and mental health. They were the top 3. Now, this is the first time that mental health has been identified by this group as being a national issue. Matter of fact, the percentage of young people indicating mental health as a top national concern has doubled in the last 6 years. When these same young people were asked them, okay, they're the national concerns, what are your top personal concerns? Your top personal concerns. 44.4% said they're highly concerned about stress. 37.8% said they're highly concerned about school. And 30.6% said body image. Now, I don't know what's going on, guys, but for me, when I was 15 to 19, I don't remember being stressed. Was it stressful for you, that period of your life? And yet we've got a whole bunch of kids these days who are saying that it is extremely stressful. See, what happens is that we end up with, these figures are actually quite alarming. And so you find in ABC News, for example, nearly 1 in 4 teens meet criteria for probable serious mental illness, reports the Mission Australia report. Or you find out here, young Australians believe mental health is one of the top 3 issues facing the country, a survey says. And so what happens, reporters are picking up on it because it is actually quite alarming, the percentage of young kids that say, hey, we're actually struggling here a bit. What about in Adventist education? Well, I've been hearing some of this for a little bit. We did caffeine research project. We might have come to some of your schools. We went to nearly every Adventist high school and we asked years 9 and 10 and 11 about their caffeine consumption. Now, we've written up some of this stuff in Teach, so I'm not going to go over the caffeine data, but what I can tell you is that we use the DAS scales to ask them about their mental health. Now, this was collected in 2011. And so what we find here, have a look at this. We get 10% of the kids indicating mild depression, 11 moderate depression, severe depression 7, extremely severe 4%. So if you add that up, or if you're not that good at adding things up, you can just take the top number and go 100 minus it. What percentage of kids in Adventist schools are reporting some level of depression? What is it? I'm hearing, who's going to be brave enough to say a number out loud? Thank you, 32%, nearly a third. Nearly a third. When you actually look at the rest of the scales, this is for anxiety, you find out about 30%. And when you look at stress, about 23%. Now, the worrying thing about this is that we know from Beyond Blue that nearly 85% of Australians go on to have a mental illness, either depression, anxiety or stress, sometime in their lives. These are the kids that are exhibiting it in school. When you have a look as well, that you look by gender, you can actually see there is a significant difference between males and females, with females generally being more depressed, anxious and stressed. And particularly the stress scale is very interesting in that the effect size, if you're into stats, at 0.28 shows that there is a significant difference between females and males in our school population. Value Genesis 2 was done with Barry Game. And so he went out to Adventist schools. Don't you love that picture of Barry? And he's saying that when they went out in the same year, we did the data collection for the caffeine study in 2010-11. This data was collected in 2011. Now, I got access to the data. Barry gave me the data file, and so I've been doing some further analysis. And in actual fact, when you look at value genesis, even though Barry didn't report it in the publication, there is a well-being scale in there. And so I've run the stats on the well-being scale and actually found out when we look at the distribution, we actually find out on here, on a scale of 1 to 6, this is the well-being scale, that 28% of the kids in Adventist schools, you're getting around that third again, isn't it? Around that many kids fall below the halfway point on the well-being scale. Now, what I can tell you is that when you look at the 2015 data from Mission Australia, you can actually find some Adventist schools participated in the 2015. Matter of fact, one of the Adventist schools asked me to come and do a talk to their kids because they were so worried about their results. So this is a result from an Adventist school. Nearly 3/4 of the kids at that school said that one of their major concerns was their school. Then stress and body image and family conflict and bullying. Then, of course, the latest data, which comes from the Quality Adventist Schools project, and data that's collected by Insight SRC. Your schools are all doing this. There is a well-being measure in there that kids fill out. I asked Mark and Daryl if I could have access to the system data on this. So this is a collection of you all. This is where we fit on the wellbeing data of students, and that little block there is the area that 60% of the schools that Insight SRC have measured would normally fall. And you can see that we are, now I won't use the word significantly because that has statistical implications, but it looks to me like we're a fair way short of that. So from all this, I can actually conclude I'm starting to get enough signs coming out of the data from Adventist schools that I'm beginning to think we've got a wellbeing problem. That our students in our schools may not be trucking as well as what we think they are. And I tell you, when you have low levels of wellbeing amongst kids, it's very difficult for them to do well at school. Matter of fact, those kids that were in that 11% that had extreme depression or very high levels of depression were at a level that could not function properly at school in that caffeine study. I actually think that we seriously are at risk, that with the current levels of well-being, we run the risk of not preparing students for the joy of service in this world. Because I don't think we're going to be able to prepare them to do much at all if we can't get the levels of well-being sorted. Now, I don't think we should panic about it. What I think we've got to recognise is that Adventist education has been born in times of crisis. We know in 1863, when the church started, it was in the middle of the American Civil War. The country was at war with itself. And we know that if you think about what life was like back then, it certainly was not a time of ease, and this family was given the charge of trying to sort it out. And sure, it seems a long time ago, we journey forward, and we finally get to 2017. But I think that in the room, collectively, we've got to say that we are called to rise to this challenge. The challenge of doing something about the levels of well-being of kids in our schools. But how did well-being get like this? I mean, why are the numbers so low? I think there's a number of contributing factors. Let me just quickly go over them with you. Let me introduce you to Kate and Zach McLaughlin. Zach came home from work one day and asked his mum, "What's for tea?" She said, "Spaghetti." He said, "All right, I'll be back." And he walked outside and jumped in his car and drove down the road and killed himself. He was 19. Kate has made a bit of a name for herself because she stood up at her son's funeral, and you can imagine what a traumatic experience that was. And she was quite blunt. She actually said, "We're here today because of a choice Zach made, a bad choice. A choice that followed many smaller bad choices he made that left him feeling helpless and with no way out. He had financial problems and he chose to end his life to solve them." See, Zach had got some speeding fines and some parking fines, and it all compounded when it went to court, and now he was being faced with about a $2,000 fine. He was losing his licence for 6 months. His employer said he was going to lose his job because he wouldn't be able to get to work, and it was all snowballing on him, and he chose to end his life as a way of dealing with that. Have a listen to Kate.
Really tough with the social media life they live and the real life and the responsibilities of growing up, and knowing and understanding that the problems that come are all temporary and that life is a transition from beginning to end, and these things come and they go, but that there is help. It seems that this generation has instant gratification, that they have instant everything online, on Facebook. You want someone to like the way you look, you put up a picture. You want to buy something, you just buy it. But then I think when it comes to solving a problem, there's not enough resilience for these kids to see themselves through that problem. They want something instant, and it's not possible. Life is a learning curve and there's challenges for everybody, but I think this generation has that social side to their life, which the side that they want everybody to think they have. But then, unfortunately, those real relationships and that communication that's not had between people because it's electronic really affects these kids' abilities to talk.
She seems to blame the social media and particularly the whole Facebook generation as being a major contributing factor to her son's demise. I think sometimes we underestimate the impact that the internet is having on our lives, and particularly the mobile internet. In Australia, for example, there are 16 million people who use Facebook, and that's nearly 70% of the population. And what we find is that kids saturated in the social media environments end up sort of living in that bubble where messages are sort of reflected back around their communities. And I tell you, Facebook is extremely successful because they know how to target young people. With the algorithms that they use driving that software platform, it's amazing.
Young Australians when they're most vulnerable so that advertisers can exploit them. The Australian reports that internal documents outline how the social network can target moments when young people need a confidence boost. It does so by monitoring posts, pictures and interactions. Information on their mood, including feeling worthless, overwhelmed or nervous, is then made available to advertisers.
It's amazing that Facebook, what it does, it monitors. It uses computers to monitor your posts, or it looks at your Google searches. Have you ever noticed, I was looking for a pillow. It is my birthday on June 20. If you want to write that down now, I'm happy for you to send me some sort of gift. Although if you're a friend of mine on Facebook, Facebook will tell you it's my birthday on June 20. And I wanted a pillow. I've never had a pillow, but at 57 years of age, sleeping in a tent a lot, I decided I'm going to get a pillow. And so I started Googling pillows for bushwalking, found a Cedar Summit's got a really good pillow. And so I said to my wife, hey, instead of buying me a shirt, like I do every year for a birthday, how about you get me this pillow? So she said, okay, I'll buy it. So she wrote it all down. Mate, for the next week, every time I went on the computer, all I got was ads for Cedar Summit pillows. And what it does, I mean, who cares about my pillow? But what I can tell you is that this is insidious the way it looks at, it tracks what you're doing and then guesses what your desires are and constantly upholds those desires in front of you. Now, it can manipulate us. I know as well that with respect to Facebook, that at the moment we have a number of friends who are travelling around Europe, and what do? We get pictures of them. Flying paragliders here, flying paragliders there, eating here, having this sort of cream caramel dessert. And my wife's going, oh, I wish we were in Europe. You know, what you're seeing is the highlight parts of everybody's life, and then you start thinking that's the normal, that's where the bar is, and I'm at Avondale working away in my office and my life isn't as good as theirs. And suddenly there's something within me that just thinks that it's not happening for me. And the hours that we spend.
Ever felt guilty about the amount of time you spend in front of a screen? A new book explores how humans are hardwired for technology addiction and offers suggestions on how to break the habit. It's called Irresistible and was written by an academic from New York University. Marketing and psychology professor Adam Alter reveals how social media apps and other online sites are designed to hook us in and ultimately change our human behaviour. We'll talk tech addiction shortly, but first, Late Line's Michael Vincent takes us inside the mind of an app developer.
Australian men unlock their phones 45, almost 46 times a day. Australian women 42 times. Australian men unlock their phone more than anyone else in the world that we've been able to collect the data on so far. It is astounding. 28% of entire phone time for an Australian is spent on Facebook. from our data. The second largest is usually an internet browser, that's generic. Then you have Facebook Messenger, then you have WhatsApp, then you have Instagram. And depending on the demographic, Snapchat will move dramatically. It'll either be low for older people, but quite high for younger people. Australian men and women spend about 2 hours a day on their phones, and that excludes music streaming, video streaming, no Netflix, no Spotify, and no phone calls. The biggest user we have at the moment is a woman in America who's using her phone for 7.5 hours a day, every day on average, which is, that's a full-time job.
It's incredible, isn't it? Now, be honest, since I stood up here and started talking about 35 minutes ago, who has actually checked their Facebook feed during my talk? What, you're not going to admit it? You know, it is incredible. And what happens is that with a 21-year-old daughter and a 23-year-old son still living at home, I get to witness very close hand the interaction of young people, or not so young people now with my kids because they're grown up, but the way that they just live in that media. I'm a technology lecturer. I love technology. The last thing I'm going to tell you is to go and close down your Facebook account and get rid of your mobile phone. But you know what? If you can't control it, that device is going to end up doing a lot of damage in your life. That's the reality. And I actually think that we've got the situation that now, with technology and the pervasive aspect of it, that young people are losing the ability to self-regulate and need someone to point it out. Now, I don't particularly like prohibition, and I don't particularly like all these rules about you can't have a phone at school and all this, because I actually think they can do some marvellous things. But I tell you what, they need some help. They need some help. The other thing I'd just like to turn around quickly, because our time's going, is ask the question, how come so many kids listed school and study as a problem? I think we've got a problem with Australian schooling. I heard a lecture last year with Yong Zhou, and he pointed out, he's got a great book, it's worth reading, called World Class Learners. He pointed out that a society is changing so quickly that we're ending up with an ever-increasing disconnect between traditional schooling and society. In actual fact, he pointed to Nokia, who was once the most successful mobile phone company, who essentially went out of business because they failed to adapt. It's interesting, they're trying to make a comeback, aren't they, Nokia, with a smartphone now? But here, the most successful company went under because they didn't come on board with a smartphone. Yong Zhou reckons that it's all about adaptation. And we know that when we look at the Australian workforce, we know that there's a plethora of different jobs around there, but we also know that things are changing. I mean, if you live in South Australia, the number of people who have been impacted as one automobile plant after another is shut down. Holden, Ford, and on it went. When you look at the employment data, we know that the percentage of people in the sort of working manufacturing is very much on the decline, and that it's service industries and creative industries that are on a rise. When you look at the sort of breakdown of who does what in Australian society, you can actually see there that manufacturing there is about 7.6% of the workforce. But as you go around, you can see healthcare and associated industries, a large chunk. Education and training, accommodation and food service, you can sort of see where the large chunks are. But when you look at where the shifts are going, you can see health services are very much on the increase. And why is that? Yeah, because we're all getting old. And then you have a look at manufacturing is very much on the decrease. What happens is that the Australian Future Workforce Report, the government report that came out in 2015, points to the fact that there's a high probability that 40% of the Australians' workforce, more than 5 million people, could be replaced with automation within the next 10 to 20 years. I think one of the problems that we've got is that a lot of young people at the moment go to school and study stuff not really having an appreciation of where this stuff is going to take them. We ended up with my daughter when she would finish year 12 from Macquarie College, which was a great school for my kids. we ended up with the sort of after party of their school formal at our house between 10:30 and 12:30 that night, the longest 2 hours of my life. As I walked around those kids, I would say between a third and a half of them didn't really know what they wanted to do in life and what they wanted to do next year. Now, that's no fault of the schools. That's the problem, is that we're preparing young people for a future that is changing so quickly. Are we giving them the skills to meet what Australian society needs? I mean, we know, Yong Shou's solution to this, by the way, he said we need to be preparing young people to think like entrepreneurs. That what you do is there's a difference between the way entrepreneurs think, where, you know, they're flexible and they build teams and they make adjustments as they go, versus sort of the more classic administrative styles. People have got to be flexible just because the way it's changing. I mean, he used the example of driverless cars. Now, I don't know about you, but I sort of think driverless cars are very much of the future. But he pointed out that with driverless cars, when you no longer need to park your car, for example, because it goes away and just comes back and gets you, that there is going to be the need for in-car entertainment systems because you don't need to concentrate on the road. So he says that what happens is that there's a real dislocation in terms of what's required by driverless cars coming on the scene, because the sort of things that people in driverless cars do can be quite different. But surely, I mean, that's so far in the future, but if you look at this graph, it says there, if I read that correctly, 2030, the estimation is that only self-driving cars can be purchased in the United States. 2026, underneath it, halfway along, 100% of cars sold will be autonomous. That's a Morgan Stanley report. So last time I checked, that's under 10 years from now, isn't it? I mean, these are rapid changes to the way society is likely to function when we have technology like this coming on board. And once upon a time, we looked at the workplace, and the curriculum that we taught was a reflection of what the workplace needed. But I can't help but think we're entered an area where there's becoming a separation between what workplaces need and what the curriculum is offering. I mean, the research on the sort of skills that young people need points to critical thinking, creativity, digital skills. These are the futures. And yet, when you look at what schools do, the research, for example, on creativity shows that there is a huge decline in creativity across the ages of schooling. Kids in kindergarten, if you give them a creativity test, 98% score at the genius level. By the time they get to year 10, you've got something like only 10% of them do. And we find that generally in life there's a decline, we decline, and huge drop-offs in creativity, and that continues to drop off throughout life until you finally hit retirement, and then there's a little sort of boost. So, there's light at the end of the rainbow. Daryl, Brian, who else can I pick? And if you think critical thinking, another thing that's required, if you think about it, I very much I love sitting in Tim Pope's presentation. He did his PhD on critical thinking and bioethics, and he found out that Christians scored significantly lower in critical thinking than non-Christians in solving ethical problems. I just tend to think that we're ending up with these sort of tsunami-like forces. By the time we have young people in a school studying curriculum that we're struggling to keep up with the curriculum change that's required to match societal change, being inundated with technological advances and social media phases that cause interactions to become different. I think we have such a changing dynamic that what we're doing is that I think there's a whole bunch of kids that are being pushed into low levels of well-being because they're quite frankly just struggling to cope. So what should we do about it? What should be Adventist education's response? How do Adventist schools stay on track in the 21st century? How do we educate the whole person for service in this world and eternity? How do we do that? Well, I think what we'll see, if you, this just caught my eye on the ABC News. For teachers, there are bigger problems in our classroom than Gonski. And you think, what? Bigger than funding models? And if you scroll down in this paper, it comes up and it actually says student well-being should be the central to education discussions. And I think she's identified it. In actual fact, the problems that we have in schools at the moment is that we're concentrating on a lot of things that don't matter. And what does matter is the levels of student well-being that we have. And I think if we actually changed our schools, it was interesting but very tragic. The other day I was on a train in Sydney where the train actually hit a person and killed them. Now, I don't know if you've ever had that happen, but this train stopped and there was a body under the train, and I got told this train's going nowhere for 2.5 hours. Next minute there was like 100 police there. And so what do? Everyone hops off the train at Roseville Station. Well, I looked at Uber. Of course, there's now a congestion tax. $46 to get to Pymble Station where my car was. So I looked at Google Maps and I thought, it's only 6 kilometres, I'll walk. I've got 6 kilometres of my life. It's up and downhill, that road, I tell you. And so I walked, and because I didn't want to walk on the main highway with all the car fumes, I walked the next street over, and I walked past 3 schools, 2 private and 1 state, and what amazed me was every one of those schools had a sign up somewhere that says, "We are a well-being school. We enhance the well-being of the students that come here." I mean, it's become a marketing tool, isn't it? A wellbeing school. I went to the Positive Education Conference. Did you know they had 2,700 people in that room and a waiting list to get in? When everyone's concerned about it. And what you find that a lot of the people, schools that choose to address wellbeing of their students, because educators recognise what a huge issue it is, they turn to the likes of guys like Martin Seligman. Obviously, he's written his book Flourish. It's one of the seminal works. He presented his PERMA theory there, that to have high levels of well-being, you need to have these sort of things in your life: positive emotions, high level of engagement, positive relationships, meaning, experience accomplishment. Meaning, by the way, Seligman's defined as getting meaning in life through service to others. These are all commendable things. And I think we could push for it. And there's even an association that many of us in the room, I'm sure, are members of, the Positive Education Schools Association. What's interesting for me, though, I say, if we design an intervention in schools based on positive psychology, it's called the Positive Education Movement, will that be enough for us? Will it be enough? Okay, quick lesson in statistics. Here's a population. We do something to it. We move the mean. So the difference between those means, we can actually do a t-test to work out if they're different, but we can look at an effect size, which is a statistical measure of how much impact the thing that we just did has made. Has everybody got that? When you look at effect sizes, we know, and this is coming out of John Hattie's book, that typically if it's below 0, you're doing damage. If it's between 0 and 0.3, that's typical sort of effects that we get that your normal everyday teacher could deliver. If it's above 0.4, this is the zone of desirable effects that we really want to pursue, things like that in schools. So then I went and had a look at positive psychology interventions. This is a meta-analysis of randomised control studies looking at schools that have used positive psychology to change the well-being of the students. What do you think the effect size is? Have a guess. If it's above 0.4, it's really good. If it's below 0.4 and between 0.4 and 0.3, it's sort of okay, but below that it drops off. Right, put up your hand if you think it's going to be above 0.4 in terms of increasing the well-being of the students. I think I saw 3 hands, 4 hands. Right, put up your hand if you think it's going to be below 0.4. There it is. 0.34 for subjective well-being, 0.2 for psychological well-being, and 0.23 for depression, indicating small effects for positive psychology interventions. So what I can tell you, folks, is that just running a positive psychology intervention in a school is not good enough. It's just not good enough. It does point out, this article, that a follow-up from 3 to 6 months, effect sizes are small but still significant for subjective well-being and psychological well-being, indicating that effects are fairly sustainable. One of the big problems you have in these well-being programs is you can have a bit of a hit. I mean, in Adventist education, we seem to be really good at trying to do stuff for Year 9. And you can have a bit of a hit in Year 9, but by Year 10, it's all gone away. So you've got to do something that lasts. We're on the homeward track, guys. Can we do better? I actually think we can. We need to recognise that well-being is a fairly complex construct. I really like the work of Roger Walsh. Roger Walsh is an Australian psychiatrist lecturing in the University of the United States. He wrote a very important paper, Lifestyle and Mental Health, came out in the American Psychologist in 2011. In that he outlined 8 therapeutic life changes that can make a substantive impact on your well-being. And look at those changes: exercise, diet and nutrition, time in nature, have a life of contribution and service, good relationships, high levels of recreation, relaxation and stress management, attend to the religious and spiritual. Now, guys, let me just ask you, have you heard of these things before somewhere? Have you heard of these things? In actual fact, when I read the book Education, it's full of it, isn't it? Those very themes. And what I believe that we need to do is I asked John Shapazik, who's written extensively on Ellen White. He's the director of the Ellen White Research Centre at Avondale. And he came up with, he says, the themes developed in her writings between 1888 and 1911, when she was aged 64 to 84, including the book Education, highlight the following areas. We shall pursue in Adventist education authentic spirituality, healthy relationships, professional development, including service, and personal development. These are the things that Roger Walsh is talking about. It would seem to me that if we want to have effective impacts on well-being of Adventist kids, we need to go to models that take Ellen White's advice, contemporised by Roger Walsh, they're the same themes, and do that in schools. And then what would that look like? Well, in the 2 minutes as I finish, I've come up with a bit of a model. And I think the model would look like this. Let me just run you through very quickly. Now, I am doing a workshop tomorrow afternoon. I've talked a bit about the why we need to be doing something. In that workshop tomorrow, I'm going to be talking about the how to actually do it in your school. So if you're interested, come along. I think we do have to tend to, let me quickly just run around, we do have to attend to school climate and connectedness. You know, when I looked at the Value Genesis study, if I regress connected to school onto well-being, I find the standardised regression coefficient is 0.32. That's a moderate effect. If you connect kids to school so they feel connected, they feel accepted and valued, that we know that will enhance their well-being. That's data from Adventist schools. In the Inside SRC, you get this, I'm assuming, on your school report. This is the model that you're all working with at the moment, and it is true that if you work on teaching climate, as illustrated in those small things, it will impact student well-being. Mind you, I think this diagram could be a little bit different, because I actually think that the student well-being, instead of an outcome variable, could come about halfway along, because I think that if you have high levels of student well-being, that can impact student behaviour. See, I think many of these relationships are recursive. See how it says there, a weak link between student well-being and academic achievement? I've looked at 3 meta-analyses, and one of them found an effect size of 0.56. Now you remember, is that big? 0.56 between student well-being and academic achievement. I think Inside SRC, I'm sure they're all good people, but I think they've slightly underestimated the flow-on effect of student well-being in terms of academic success in school. So I do think that we ought to be trying to connect kids to our schools and have a better climate. And we do that by having high academic standards coupled with strong teacher support, an environment in which adult and student relationships are positive, and a physically and emotionally safe school environment. And as we do that, you know, healthy relationships, better connections, they help us deal with stress. I really like this, that in a study of over 100 people, researchers found that people who completed a stressful task experienced faster recovery when they were reminded of people who they had strong relationships with. Those who were reminded of stressful relationships, on the other hand, experience even more stress and higher blood pressure. You see, stress drives us through to connections. When we're stressed, our bodies produce oxytocin. It actually is a hormone that drives us towards human connection. So I think that connections to school and school climate are pivotal, but that in its own is not enough. I think we need explicit well-being instruction. We need to make time in our curriculum for explicit well-being instruction. I've worked with Josh Brown on the Invictus program that we've been running at Macquarie College. Josh is the champion of that. You know, that school, Bruce has got a very, very good school going there. Do you think his school, Bruce rings me up every year and tells me that their school's nearly in the top school in New South Wales. Do you think that school's going to lightly give up curriculum time for a wellbeing program? It took years of asking, and then finally we got permission to run some wellbeing stuff in worship at the beginning of the school day. Now that's morphed over into now having a curriculum space. I think, whereas Bruce, I think you get one period every cycle, so 75 minutes a cycle, for explicit wellbeing instruction, because one of the things we know now is that wellbeing can be taught. Most of you will know Angela Lee Duckworth. She's done her work on grit. And so I'm not going to talk about that, but what I will tell you is that Angela Lee Duckworth, one of the best contributions she's made is that she tells us that grit is not a trait we have. Grit can be taught. Grit can be developed. And many of the aspects of well-being can be developed in young people with help. And so I think our schools need to make curriculum time for it. And so the Invictus Award is the award that at Macquarie College we're running. There are, I think, about 8 or 9 schools now that are running the Invictus program. And certainly it is a great program based on a morphing of the Duke of Edinburgh program that encourages the developing of wellbeing in schools. If you're interested, that's the URL that you can go and have a look, or come along tomorrow, we'll talk a bit more about it. But one of the things I want to say about this is that a number of our Adventist schools are running good wellbeing interventions. Like, Dust and Dever with that challenge program is a great intervention, isn't it? I've just been talking to Daryl that what I think we do is that it's unfortunate that the schools are really successful, have really good in-school champions, and they're developing and pushing a thing, but not every Adventist school has an in-school wellbeing champion. And I think that it's about time that we actually probably formalise some sort of approach of developing a wellbeing curriculum that could be rolled out to support Adventist schools, because it's such an important work. I think as well that what we want to do is concentrate on outdoor education, as we're nearly there. The thing with outdoor education, did you know in the Australian curriculum there's a whole outdoor learning section? The research tells us that even the fact of taking people outdoors, it doesn't have to be outdoor education, but just going outdoors to do stuff, has huge positive effects. Just by going outside to study science and maths and some of these things. And so really I see now that outdoor education is a continuum with outdoor learning at one end, and then you end up with outdoor education, which is the activity-based stuff up the other end. And look at the sort of stuff you get as benefits that have been identified in research as a result of doing outdoor learning and outdoor education. It is unfortunate, I think, that our schools struggle though, in that most of your schools run camping programs, and I'm sure that if I came and researched your camping programs, they, across the board, would not be doing as well as what you think in terms of the contribution to student wellbeing. Because what I do know is that successful wellbeing programs, this is out of James Neal's PhD thesis, there's a number of things that need to be put in, that you need to have an successful outdoor education program. The sort of activity, the way it's facilitated, the group you're in, the program you're running, the environment you take the kids to, and the sort of individuals you have in the first place, just to quickly whiz around that. What I know is facilitation is generally done very poorly in schools, and because kids go camping once a year, they don't have the ability to develop any hard skills, so we end up with teacher-led programs, or even worse in my view, programs that are outsourced to external bodies. And so then you don't have that richness of developing the connections between kids and staff, and actually having journeying aspects where kids learn resilience and everything else in team environments, because the programs aren't facilitated well. And so I think if you want to run a good outdoor education program, we should look very carefully how we do outdoor education, because generally across Adventist schools it's done quite poorly. I do think we ought to have quality KLAs. I like the word quality. The quality teaching model is just tremendous. Don't you love guys like this? Eddie Wu. You see him the other day on Australian Story? Let me just play a segment of Eddie is a maths teacher, and then started using an iPad to video his maths lessons and put him online for students that wanted to watch the maths lesson again later. I mean, listen to him interviewed on Insight.
Eddie, you teach maths every day, not just in the classroom. Let's have a look at you in action on what you call your WooTube channel.
The sort of mind-blowing thing for me, anyway, happened when you say, okay, take this guy and just move him over here, right? So that's 5 and that's x. And then take this guy and turn him around so that he fits on like this. Because remember, the length is X, right? And that's like, you see it, right? And then you're like, like this shape, if only I could do something meaningful with this, what do I need to add on in order to make this thing? And the answer is, look, this is right, and that's right. Oh, I should square it, right? So you add on 25. Yeah, that's the thought I had. So you're like, so this is x squared plus 20x. The reason I halve is so I can do this construction. And then the reason I square is so I can complete the square, right? Then of course once you have all the other
I so wish I'd had a maths teacher like that. It would have been, I may have had a completely different career. Your maths lesson, those maths lessons have clocked up millions of views, I think more than 3 million, right? So what do you think is the key to engaging with students?
We've heard it quite a few times tonight. I think people think of mathematics as a very abstract thing. For me, it's always been about, it's the struggle for a human being to wrap their head around something that's confusing at first and requires a real change in perspective, but then all at once, and you sort of heard that moment when the kids...
Yeah, well, numbers of moments, the oohs and the ahs and the recognition,
When you can bring people along with you, mathematics, people think it's about numbers or it's about shapes, and they're there, but they're really about people trying to grapple with this world around us and why it is the way it is and why rainbows are round. What's up with that? And a mathematician tried to work that out, and we know the reasons why, and it's beautiful. So for me, connecting with people and bringing them along in that journey is just endlessly exciting.
I'd love to have a maths teacher like that. I mean, his passion is incredible. And I always know that BOAG research that came out in '89 that says one of the most important things teachers do is that they actually enthuse students. They give them a passion for the area. And when I'm talking about quality KLAs, I'm talking about this idea of passing on passion to students in a quality experience. I also like some of the problem-based learning approaches I'm hearing because I love the fact that it actually assigns knowledge to a problem and gives it a relevance and authenticity instead of knowledge being just an abstract thing that we're sort of memorising. And so I applaud schools that are looking at problem-based learning, and also some of the rise as well of some of the VET stuff that's going on in schools now, trying to have a much more applied approach. Lastly, I just think that we need to attend to the spiritual program of the school. I know that we're very proud of the Encounter program and the way that it can introduce students to a saviour. But I think that the Encounter program, combined with the chaplaincy programs of schools that offer connections and support, and they allow kids to meet and interact with God and have that sort of special experience through worship assemblies and everything else, and engage in service activities. I mean, this is the richness of it all. So guys, I think that in summary, Adventist education, it's not rocket science. We could do a model like that tomorrow in every Adventist school, and I think we'd see the levels of well-being of the kids in our schools significantly increase. I have simplified it a little bit because in actual fact I was playing around going back to here. It looks like that so I could talk about it. But in reality, the way it operates is probably more like this, where you end up with this sort of big school climate, then outdoor education stretched across and the spiritual program, and then wellbeing, instruction and quality KLAs mixed in there. So tomorrow in the workshop we'll talk a little bit more about the how you actually pull that off in your school. I'll just finish by saying then that I'm passionate about Adventist education. I've certainly had multiple opportunities to work elsewhere. I'm still here. I believe in it. I believe that we can do a great job in the 21st century. But we're in the restoration business, and there's something magical that occurs when you take something that's been a bit damaged and a bit beat up and not quite what it should be, and then you sort of restore it back. You imagine these kids, how beautiful they are. You imagine them restored in their image of the Maker. Mate, I can't think of anything better to do with my life or yours. Thanks a lot.